get started about kind of your growing up and things like that and starting. Um, for everyone at home, just like tell us kind of in your own words, about your condition and kind of how that kind of started.
Yeah, so for me, when I was younger, everything, yeah, I was a normal person. And then in 2018, I went in for a routine minor operation to my toenail, which is like a bilateral operation to remove, yeah, basically ingrowing nature of it on each side. I went in, walk into that. It's meant to be a same day procedure. Happens to everyone. And the pain as a result of it afterwards was unbearable, and it meant that basically I couldn't walk out that day. Originally, we were told it was normal and it might take a few days to get back to normal. But as time went on, it was quite clear that um, nothing was changing, and it only got worse from there when people kind of struggled to believe the situation, and everyone said it looked fine and stuff, and that eventually resulted in trauma, which further down the line, kind of in the middle of 2019, I lost complete memory. So I don't remember anything before 2019, which I was 15. So yeah, basically everything had to be relearned, how to read, write, talk. And yeah, so basically it's starting again as a child in an adult's body.
How does that sort of work, relearning stuff, and how long does that process take for you?
Um, it's obviously one where for me it was easier than other people who knew me because for me I didn't remember walking, I didn't remember people. So
Yeah.
for me I hadn't lost anything, I just couldn't remember things. And so it was one where it was more for family and others that knew me before. It was more difficult to accept because obviously they could remember everything and that I had gone through. Yeah, I mean, obviously for me, it started being out of education from the point at which I had my operation. And then the point where I lost my memory, it took about, I want to say, 4 or 5 months before I started having any form of education again. That started off being more just kind of speech therapy and a couple hours a week, someone coming to our house to do a little bit of kind of basic English and maths, and then that progressed where the following year I started going into an institution where it was one-to-one support, and then COVID hit, which complicated things because then it meant they were trying to turn things into more group sessions, so like three or four people to one adult, and I struggled with that because it was overwhelming. I hadn't been in that environment before. Um, and then by the end of like when COVID started calming down and I had passed my GCSEs, well, by predicted grades, then I went to college to do CTEX, which was basically in business, which was intended just to top up those GCSEs because I only had the basic two, English and maths, which fortunately I did have pass, so I didn't have to redo. Although I tried to redo maths, got it up from a 5 to a 6, but yeah, I mean, obviously, I would have liked to maybe get a 7, but given what I'd been through, obviously, we have to accept that anything that's passed is good enough. And so, yeah, it kind of went from there. Then I went on to doing BTEC in sport, again, trying to stay out of doing exams just because it's one where I hadn't really had any practice in doing exams, and something coursework or 100% coursework based was definitely easier. So that's kind of where we ended up. Then obviously I had the option of going to uni, but I decided to focus on my tennis instead.
Yeah, it's proven to be quite a good choice to have focused on the tennis. But you've obviously got like in a big support group. Obviously, your mum's quite a big part of that. How important is it to have a good support group in order to make big decisions like not going to university and choosing to focus on the tennis?
Yeah, I think it's one where any decision like that you can't rush. Um, for me originally it was one where we were looking, completely at that route and weighing up the pros and cons. We also had options to look to go somewhere in America. But ultimately, it came down to what was my main goal, and also with something like a career in sport, it's one where while it's valuable to have qualifications, your interest might change over time, and so you don't really want to lock yourself into one particular degree and then feel like at the end of your career you need to change. And obviously, university is one of those that you can come back to at any time. Um, and I felt with where I had got to at that point in tennis and academics that I could get an offer again in future, should I wish to go. And yeah, it's obviously one where most people in my family had gone through the traditional route of, when you leave school, you go to university and then you get a normal job. So I think it was a little bit of a curveball to them, but I felt pretty clear on my plan, and it was obviously one where when I first kind of brought it up that that's what I felt was the right decision for me, it was a bit of a surprise to people, but um, eventually kind of people could understand my reasoning, and then obviously fully supported it. And then it was just obviously making sure that from a tennis perspective, I can make sure that I was giving it enough commitment to justify that decision, because whereas you're doing education, you can't do tennis 100% on the side. There has to be a balance. Whereas obviously, as soon as you lose the educational standpoint, then you can go in 100% with tennis. So it's just making sure, not just financially, but also feasibility with coaches' availabilities, etc., that it was possible.
Yes, well, in the end, I guess you became a pro, so it's kind of worked out it was possible, and you've managed to like pave that way really well. But it all kind of started properly with the LTA, that National Junior Wheelchair Program. I think was it 15 that you got accepted into that?
So that was start of 2020. So yeah, I mean, I'd only been playing wheelchair tennis for, I want to say, about 7 months to that
Wow.
point. Um, had the opportunity to come about, I definitely wouldn't be where I am now, because it definitely gave me a different outlook on the sport. But yeah, obviously to get that type of support so quickly after starting, obviously made a big difference in how I perceive the sport for sure.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, your coach was quite important in the start of it. Obviously, that encouraging you to enter tournaments and stuff very early on and that. But what was kind of the program like? And what did you do from when the coach was like, "Oh, I think you should enter tournaments," to then getting accepted into the program? What's kind of that journey?
Um, so yeah, obviously the first couple of events I played in 2019, I was very apprehensive doing so, just because it's obviously taking something that you're doing for fun and turning it into something that's a bit more competitive, which obviously there is a fun element to it, but when you've not really done that stuff before, it's sometimes a little bit difficult to recognize that. And so yeah, there's a lot of apprehension. The first event I played, especially playing an adult event, but I competed well in one match, and I think that improved my enjoyment a little bit. And there was also people there that I'd kind of come to know, having played for the previous 3 or so months. And then at the end of 2019, I did my first junior event, which was like the national UN finals. And that was like my first opportunity to kind of see other young juniors play. And obviously, those are the guys that, a lot of them, I'm still training and competing with now. So yeah, obviously, it was quite a quick step up, because I'd only played 2 competitions and suddenly I'm getting supported by the LTA. But yeah, obviously it was one where their support kind of brought a whole new dynamic with it, because it started as one that was very recreational, and suddenly there's a professional element to it, where performance actually did matter a little bit. And so yeah, obviously it was an exciting new chapter, but it was definitely, there's a lot of unknowns with it.
How do you kind of navigate all the unknown? Obviously, within 7 months, you've gone from starting to pick up a racket for the first time in a wheelchair to end up getting put on the LTA's program. It's quite a big jump, and with a lot of unknowns, it can be quite overwhelming. So how did you kind of deal with that sort of change and challenge?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously it started out when we found out it was a surprise because there was no expectation, and then obviously the timings kind of coincided with COVID, which complicated things just because that then impacted how much group training there was. And that did cause its own challenges because then it added a new element of doing things online, which I had never really done before. Um, and it wasn't really for the first 6 or so months before I actually saw any of the guys in person. Um, a lot of the training was in isolation, and that probably helped a little bit because it was more similar to what I had known before. But yeah, it's obviously one where you've got to start getting used to having a bit of pressure of performing well and improving and stuff, which when I set out with the sport, that was definitely not my intention.
What was kind of your your intentions when picking up the racket? Was it just to get back into sport, or was it more just just to enjoy yourself again playing?
It was definitely one where I wasn't the key reason behind starting. It was one where from the operation in October 2018 until that point in May 2019, I basically spent all of my time at home doing very little, and it was originally finding something to get me out of the house. So it started with wheelchair tennis, also tried a bit of archery and horse driving. Um, and obviously tennis was the one that kind of stuck more. And I think obviously there was definitely a little bit of enjoyment there. Um, but it was obviously one where I wasn't really sure how much I enjoyed it and whether or not I wanted to take it more seriously or do it more frequently, because it obviously started out as something I maybe did once a week, maybe twice a week at best. So there was no expectation at the start. But yeah, it's just um, trusting if you enjoy something and you want to pursue it more, then following through with that. Then you get the curiosity of where it might lead, and that's really where it all started.
Yeah, I guess if it's kind of all started quite early on, but I guess you were encouraged probably because of your love for sport before the operation and stuff. Um, was your like kind of I guess attitude towards sport, was that any different before the operation? Did you still have that like that love and competitiveness for it beforehand and after it, or was it more just a thing of just enjoying it rather than anything?
Um, yeah, obviously at the time, well, I still don't remember what it was exactly like before, but from what I've been told, it wasn't immediate. It definitely took some time to kind of refine that competitive nature of things. But yeah, when I was younger, I was competing, I think, at like a county level for tennis, among similar levels of a few other sports. So I definitely had that drive, and I would definitely say it's more similar to what it is now, albeit it's not directly comparable because I don't remember it from before.
Yeah, it makes sense. So it wasn't something that was like, it wasn't something that was natural to you. It was something that you kind of redeveloped rather than like maintain throughout that sort of period.
Yeah, and I mean, everything had to be relearned. So, besides a little bit of muscle memory with how you hold a racket and kind of swing a ball or, swing and hit a ball, it was one where, yeah, all of that kind of drive and competitive nature didn't exist at that point.
Right, yeah, it's actually quite interesting to be fair, because a lot of people, would maybe expect it to be sort of a something that's like, natural in you and a sort of an innate trait, but actually to be able to redevelop that is actually really, really interesting and really a really good thing and a cool thing to have as well. That sort of that competitive nature that you redeveloped ended up with letting you become a pro. At what point do you realize, oh yeah, I can become a professional tennis player? And like, how does that kind of all work?
Yeah, I think for me it came in stages, mostly when there was setbacks. So within 6 months of coming onto an LTA program, we had a meeting which was discussing what the classification system looked like, which is basically how players are categorized based on their disabilities. And originally I was told my disability, CRPS, didn't meet those requirements because it's pay nature and effectively because it doesn't really show up on tests. So that was always kind of overhanging us. And then from the end of 2021, then I didn't have LTA support because they didn't think I'd get through with my classification. I think that was the first time where I really had to assess the situation of did I want it? Because tennis is one of those sports that's really not cheap. I was already at that point competing internationally with juniors, and that definitely asked me questions of did I really want it, or was it just because the opportunity was there? And I made it pretty clear that I did want it. But obviously I was still young and still kind of largely focusing on college. But then from 2023, when the new classification rules came in, which basically meant if you weren't officially classified in person, then you weren't allowed to compete on the adult circuit. That was basically where I was waiting for a panel to decide if my disability was eligible or not. And we had like a 3-month limbo period where I could train, but I couldn't compete. And that was definitely the point where I made that decision that I felt that I should get through because I can't walk, and that I wanted to take it seriously. And that's definitely where the training ramped up, and there was definitely a lot more commitment to the sport.
Yeah, definitely a lot more training and commitment is needed, especially to, make it to the very top level. But in terms of being able to, cover all the costs, because as tennis players, a lot of people might already know that you have to pay, for your own travel, your coaches, your physios, your nutritionists, and all that sort of stuff. Is there like sort of funding that players like yourself get from sponsors or and a national lottery do a lot of investment into athletes as well. So is that something that you've been a beneficiary of, or is that something that you have to try and find yourself?
When I was a junior supported by the LTA, there was a small monetary amount which covered a decent proportion of the cost, but definitely not the full amount of cost. Then when I lost that, then that was when it was more difficult because sponsorships are always difficult in tennis. There's so many individual athletes who are wanting the same thing from the same companies, and often it's difficult for these companies to choose who they actually want to support. So while there was maybe a little bit from kind of smaller organizations or even some charities, a lot of it was kind of like being self-funded or funded through like my mom.
Okay, yeah, it's quite interesting. So there's a lot that you had to, dig out and kind of self-manage and be able to do for yourself. So it's quite interesting. How kind of difficult is that to be able to manage yourself? And do you still do a lot of that like today? Is that still something that you do a lot of?
Like managing financially, basically.
Yeah, just kind of like managing it all yourself, I guess, like paying different people for different things and that.
Yeah, so obviously now that I'm back supported by the LTA as of start of 2025, that obviously gives me a decent proportion to my costs. Obviously, as you become more full time and you travel further, the costs exponentially increase. And it's one where, in an ideal world, the costs would still go up further. You'd be ideally bringing a coach with you for every tournament and with you for every single training session and all that. But that's just not necessarily realistic with the amount of financial support we have access to. But yeah, obviously it's one where we're responsible for how we allocate funds, what goes to training, what goes to competitions, how we split it up, and yeah, everything else financially is our responsibility to deal with.
Yeah, it's quite a lot to actually deal with. I think that's probably one of the sides of a professional athlete that a lot of people don't kind of see, which is, quite interesting as well. But in terms of, I don't know if you know what the for example, like the men's singles at Wimbledon, I don't know if you know what they would be kind of their costs would be, but and do they have like similar funding, or would it be like would they get more or less? Like, do you know what those sort of figures are in comparison to the others?
I mean, obviously, it's difficult to compare levels just because they have so many more players, but it largely stems from the fact that it's easier for them to drive revenue. They're filling stands, their competitions more and stuff, but they definitely get more financial support. But then equally, their prize money is definitely greater. And don't get me wrong, for those able-bodied players ranked outside maybe the top 250, they're struggling just as much as we are. But for those guys ranked at the top, they're definitely finding it a lot easier than for us. The best probably comparison for us is with a Grand Slam, roughly for an able-bodied player losing in the first round of a Grand Slam pays roughly the same prize money as the winner of the wheelchair singles.
Oh wow! So it's quite a big discrepancy between the both disciplines, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's quite big actually. So does that mean that you have to, see what tournaments there are and enter yourself into more tournaments than maybe you kind of want to, or is that like do you just take it, sort of day by day, sort of figuring out what's best for you and your body?
Yeah, as we're obviously transitioning from a stage of where training is more valuable to competing is more valuable. It's one where definitely we're leading towards the direction of competing more. Now, as a sport, a lot of players start a lot later than they do the able-bodied players, so we have a lot less match experience. So that's something for me where the last few years I've definitely played more tournaments to try and build up that match volume, and just kind of feel more accustomed with how you set out in matches. In almost all events outside of the Grand Slams, we will lose more money than we earn from tournaments. So it is quite difficult because when we're training at home, we're not earning anything, but we are paying coaches. But when we're competing, we're equally not earning money most weeks. The only exception to that is Grand Slams. So if by playing more events, it's going to mean you qualify for the Grand Slams, then that definitely makes sense because that's where the income is. But outside of the Grand Slams, we'll go to 6 different continents at the top level, probably 5. And yeah, for example, in January, I went to Australia and lost multiple thousands of pounds because the costs are so high and the prize money if you're not playing the slam is so minimal.
So obviously, like traveling around the world as a professional athlete is like a real, it's what a lot of people kind of dream of from a very young age when they start picking up a racket or start kicking a ball around and things like that. But it obviously it's not all the thing that it's made out to be. Obviously, there's a lot of money involved. But did that take away any sort of enjoyment and the buzz that you get from going to different countries to play your sport? Like, was it still like obviously it's still an incredible opportunity and experience, but is that sort of like what you have to weigh up when you're picking whether you go to these events or not?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I really enjoy traveling. I love, seeing different corners of the globe, meeting new people and stuff. So that is definitely one of the big sells for me. It is just one where you have to be mindful of costs and, while you're also looking from a performance perspective, you also need to think about what makes the most sense from a financial perspective of going to a different continent for a single event is probably not as cost effective as if you're going to pay multiple, especially with the cost of flights. So yeah, it is one where there's definitely a balance, but for me personally, I really enjoy the travel, and that can be a challenge for tennis players because it feels from the surface, very glamorous, but as part of the travel, you're going to have so many issues, lost bags, delayed and cancelled flights, and so much more. And it's one where there's so much unpredictability that, yeah, some people really do struggle.
Yeah, I guess that struggle, there's a lot of things that you can't control, and as an athlete, you want to be able to control as much as you can, especially when you're like leading up to a tournament. But when you play in those tournaments, obviously you're gonna have some highs and lows. But we've got a bit more of a positive look on this one. Kind of like, what's your sort of high of like, or your favorite tournament you've played in, and kind of like, what's the reason behind it?
Ooh, what's my favorite tournament? Um, it's a good question. I would probably, I would honestly probably say one of the ones in the UK. I would say Queens,
Oh yeah.
which for us was a tour event until 2 years ago when we moved down to Eastbourne to be alongside the women in quads. Um, just because like it's such a good event. Obviously, being at home and playing on grass, it's the courts are extremely good. But also just the atmosphere there is incredible. But equally, there's so many tournaments around the globe, which some is more because it's in a really nice city or whatever, and some is just like the novelty of playing at stadiums or centres where there's been major sporting events, like summer events, for example. One of the ones in South Korea in Seoul is at where the Olympics were held in I think 1986, I think. And just like the novelty of being at centres like that is so cool to see.
Yeah, it's pretty surreal to be able to play, at such prestigious kind of grounds and events and that sort of thing. Obviously, you're playing at Wimbledon soon. That's probably one of the most prestigious in tennis. How does that kind of feel to be able to know that you're going to be playing at Wimbledon very soon? That's one of the biggest honors, I guess, as a professional athlete.
Yeah, for sure. It's definitely probably the pinnacle of the sport, both wheelchair and able-bodied. I mean, it's one where it's difficult to digest exactly what it means, just because obviously you're focusing on trying to perform as well as you can, as you possibly can. But your performance aside, yeah, it's the best event for any British player to play, and equally, most people around the world would say the exact same thing, that Wimbledon is probably the pinnacle of the sport.
Yeah, it definitely is, and the atmosphere there is absolutely incredible. I've been there before, and it's like the buzz that you get around being around those stadiums and the courts and stuff. It's pretty much unmatched in sort of on the tour as well. But what does like the brand of Wimbledon do for a tennis player like yourself? How is that going to be able to help you going forwards like after the tournament? Does that like have a big impact on what will happen later on, or?
Obviously, I think the biggest thing for us is it's one of the events with the biggest platforms. A lot of our tournaments there's minimal spectators, minimal viewership, often without live streaming, even live scoring. So the big difference is the public knowledge of the event. There's so many people at the grounds who will be there to watch, but yeah, if you say you play Wimbledon, everyone in the world's heard of it. So I think that's the impact of it, and I think hopefully from a sponsorship perspective and everything else moving forwards, it helps generate more opportunities, because that's something where, as a wheelchair tennis athlete, you do struggle, because these brands obviously often haven't heard of you so much until you're on the biggest stages. But yeah, obviously, if you can perform well and have a great week, then that will only increase those opportunities moving forwards.
Yeah, it's definitely one of those where if you perform well, it's your name is going to be out there for quite a long time. Um, but obviously, you said it's within like is it a week or is it 2 weeks for the competition?
It's just the second week of Wimbledon, so we start on the Tuesday and go through till the Sunday.
So obviously, that's quite a lot of games in a short space of time. How do you kind of develop a training program or a procedure for that to be able to look after your body, but also make sure that you're at top peak performance as well?
Yeah, obviously, grass is probably what is the toughest surface to move on in a chair, just because the resistance from the grass when you push, which means that long matches are a lot more physically demanding on the body. For me, generally, my training looks like 4 hours on court a day, plus a little bit over an hour in the gym. Plus all the recovery bits and warm-ups stuff that goes fits around that as well. Now when we're on the grass, we try and compact days a little bit more, just because the body would scream at us if we're doing that much volume. But equally, it's one where you have to be prepared to be playing long matches. Wimbledon for us is the last remaining slam where doubles is three full sets. Even Paralympics has now moved to a match tiebreak, so there's the potential to be playing two long three setters on the harder surfaces to move on in one day. So yeah, it's definitely from a load perspective. You want to keep the body as fresh as possible, but equally be happy with how you're hitting the ball.
Yeah, it's obviously, it's difficult when you're playing a long set of tennis and you have to really dig in with that last bit of energy to try and get it out. And, they can go on for a good few hours as well. So it's definitely a very demanding thing. But I just want to ask just very quickly before I get my last question in about the wheels on your wheelchair and obviously how they move about on the court. How does that kind of work in order to be able to roll the wheels across the grass and things like that without kind of damaging the court.
Yeah, so to start with sport wheelchairs, the big main two wheels have a camber of between like 20 and 24 degrees, which just helps with maneuvering and making sure you don't tip when you turn sharply. But kind of as we've done more research into what or how do we minimize the impact on the grass, we've kind of gone to wider profile tires and also casters, and we just help spread out the load a little bit more, and just makes it a little bit easier for the ground to repair itself. So yeah, I would say it's mostly that and trying to minimize the wear. It's been shown that now we don't really damage the grass, but yeah, obviously the more research it gets into it, the better.
Yeah, so I guess it's like sort of like would I be right in saying it's sort of like tiers of a sort of like in terms of like how expensive the chairs would be, and obviously like the more expensive kind of the more better suited they would be to the kind of the different sort of surfaces on tennis.
I mean, like the frame itself is the exact same regardless of surface. But yeah, I mean, the more expensive the chair, generally the more customized slash better it is for you. Is one where like the more strapping and stuff that kind of keeps you all in one place. It makes it easier so the chair turns more freely. But yeah, they're far from cheap. It's obviously an expense that the able-bodied players definitely do not have, even if we don't go through quite as many pairs of shoes as they do. But a wheelchair costs the same as a decent second-hand car. So
Wow.
yeah, they're definitely not cheap.
Yeah, it's definitely a quite expensive thing, but obviously, it's definitely a worthwhile investment. How long would they kind of last you sort of before you have to kind of get sort of a new one?
Ideally, 3 to 5 years. Some players can make this last for as much as maybe 10 years. Some of the top players will change theirs every kind of year or so just to make sure it's as optimal as possible. But it's trying to find that balance with the significant cost. And obviously, if they have sponsors who can help subsidize that cost, then it makes it a little bit more accessible to get a new chair more regularly. The only caveat is obviously if you only have one chair, which most players do, if, for example, there's structural damage, which can happen when you travel, airlines tossing chairs around, or even just pushing into a bit of concrete or something might, damage the frame. And if that happens, then you're kind of forced to use an old chair. And often the difference is when you don't replace a chair every couple of years is quite significant chair to chair. And then you're without your main chair for a number of weeks, which is far from ideal. But yeah, that's why the top guys will try and have two chairs where they can, albeit they often won't travel with two because the logistics of doing so would be a nightmare.
Yeah, I guess there's quite a lot of weight to it as well, so it's quite difficult to fit on planes and things like that. And yeah, it would be quite difficult. But just one final question. I appreciate your time, but I want to know kind of what's your aspirations sort of for Wimbledon and beyond that. What in the next year, what kind of does that year look like for you?
Yeah, I think with Wimbledon, it's one where obviously the main aim is to win, but from a realism perspective, it's one where I want to win my first match. I want to then have you know, if I don't play a seed in the first round, then have a crack at one of the top four guys in the world, and give it my best go in kind of the most optimal atmosphere, to have a successful result against those guys. And yeah, it's same with doubles. It's the level is so similar. There's definitely chances, and I obviously want to give it my best go and take it one round at a time and see where we end up. And then longer term, obviously attention starts turning towards LA. But before then, I would hope that maybe from next year I can compete in the main draws of all four slams directly, as opposed to needing a wild card. But yeah, it's a process where the rankings is a 12-month thing, so any points I gain now will be valuable in that pursuit for the next three or so slams.
Yeah, I guess those Grand Slams, it's important to be able to compete in those and, have a good chance of being at LA in 2028 and things like that as well. So, Andrew, I really appreciate your time. Thank you very much for joining us today and very best of luck with Wimbledon. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Cheers.